The knock on my door came at exactly 8:15 on a Thursday morning in late April, sharp and official like everything else the city did these days. I was in my kitchen making my second cup of coffee, the same morning routine I'd followed for 37 years in this house on Maple Street. The first cup I always drank while reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, Elena's chair still pushed in exactly where she'd left it 3 years ago. The second cup I took with me into the garden to check on the seedlings and see what needed attention. But today was different. Today, through my kitchen window, I could see my neighbor Brad Hoffman standing on his perfectly manicured lawn, arms crossed over his expensive polo shirt, watching my front door like he was waiting for a show to start. He had that self-satisfied smirk he wore whenever he thought he'd pulled off something clever. The same expression I'd seen when he'd convinced the city to install speed bumps that made it harder for Mrs. Peterson to get her old Buick in and out of her driveway. I set down my coffee mug, the same blue ceramic one Elena had bought me for Father's Day in 1992 when our daughter Maria was still living at home. The handle had a small chip from where I'd dropped it on the basement floor 5 years ago, but Elena had said it gave it character, made it more ours somehow. Now it was just mine, like everything else in this house. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I walked to the front door, my left knee making that small clicking sound it had been making since I fell off the ladder while pruning the apple tree last fall. Through the peephole, I could see a young Asian woman in a crisp city uniform holding a clipboard, and behind her, a man with a professional camera already taking pictures of my front yard. I opened the door, and the morning air carried the scent of the lilac bush that bloomed every year by my front steps. Elena had planted that bush in 1988, the year after we'd bought the house, because she said every home needed something beautiful right by the entrance to welcome people properly. Mr. Frank DeLuca? The woman's voice was polite, but businesslike, the tone of someone who did this kind of thing every day and had learned to keep emotions out of it. That's me. I'm Sarah Chen from Code Enforcement. This is Jim Morrison, our documentation specialist. We received a complaint about potential violations on your property. I looked past them at Brad, who had now been joined by his wife Jessica. She was holding their 18-month-old son Tyler while trying to look like she wasn't watching the proceedings with intense interest. Jessica had always been polite enough to me in the 5 years they'd lived next door, but I could tell she thought I was just some old man who didn't understand how neighborhoods were supposed to look in 2024. What kind of violations? I asked, though I had a pretty good idea what this was about. Overgrown vegetation, unauthorized structures, possible health hazards related to standing water and composting materials, Sarah Chen read from her clipboard. Mind if we take a look around? I stepped aside and let them into my house. The living room still had Elena's touch everywhere, though I'd stopped dusting her collection of ceramic birds the way she used to. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed our life together, our wedding day in 1971, Maria's high school graduation, Elena's retirement party from the library where she'd worked for 28 years, family barbecues in the backyard where this garden had been growing slowly, season by season, year by year. We'll need to examine the backyard primarily, Sarah Chen said, consulting her clipboard again. That's where the complaint was focused. We walked through the house toward the back door, past the kitchen where Elena's recipe cards were still organized in the wooden box her mother had made, past the small den where I watched baseball games and fell asleep in my recliner more evenings than I cared to admit. Jim Morrison was already taking pictures through the windows, documenting everything like it was evidence in a criminal case. When we stepped out onto the back porch, I tried to see my garden through their eyes, to understand how 43 years of love and careful attention might look to strangers with clipboards and cameras. My backyard wasn't just a backyard anymore. Hadn't been for decades. It was a complete ecosystem, a living thing that Elena and I had built together, plant by plant, season by season, year by year. The back fence was completely hidden behind a wall of green, grapevines that produced enough fruit for jellies and juice, climbing roses that bloomed in 3 different colors, morning glories that opened their purple faces to catch the first light of dawn. Along the left side of the yard, raised beds built from reclaimed railroad ties held rows of vegetables in various stages of growth. The early spring crops were already well established: lettuce and spinach and radishes, peas climbing up trellises made from branches I'd pruned from the neighborhood trees each winter. Behind them, the soil was prepared for the warm season crops that would go in after the last frost: tomatoes and peppers and beans and squash. The right side of the yard was devoted to fruit trees and perennial plants. Apple trees I'd grafted myself with varieties that ripened at different times, ensuring fresh fruit from July through October. Berry bushes, blueberries and blackberries and raspberries, each variety chosen for flavor rather than appearance. Herb beds that spilled over their boundaries: rosemary and thyme and oregano, basil and cilantro and dill, sage and mint and lavender. In the center of it all was the greenhouse, built from salvaged windows I'd collected over the years from houses being renovated or demolished. It wasn't pretty by modern standards: mismatched panes of glass, held together by a frame I'd welded myself from scrap metal. But it worked. Inside, seedlings grew in flats made from old wooden boxes, started from seeds I'd saved from the best plants of previous years. Scattered throughout the garden were the small structures that made it functional: compost bins built from discarded pallets, rain barrels connected to the gutters to collect water for dry spells, a tool shed constructed from materials left over from various home improvement projects. Pathways made from broken concrete connected everything, creating routes through the garden that had evolved over decades of daily use. To me, it was beautiful in the way that functional things can be beautiful when they're built with care and attention and love. Every plant, every structure, every pathway had a story, a reason for being exactly where it was. But I could see how it might look chaotic to someone who wasn't used to gardens that prioritized productivity over aesthetics. Sarah Chen was making notes on her clipboard while Jim Morrison photographed everything. They spent particular attention on the structures: the greenhouse, the tool shed, the compost bins, the raised beds. "Mr. DeLuca," Sarah Chen said after they'd walked through the entire garden, "this is quite an extensive operation. Do you have permits for these structures?" Permits? I looked around at what Elena and I had built over 4 decades. We built most of this before anyone needed permits for garden beds and tool sheds. When was the greenhouse constructed? I thought back to 1994, when Elena had been going through chemotherapy and the doctors had said that having a project, something to look forward to, would help with her recovery. We'd spent that entire summer collecting windows from construction sites and yard sales, planning the design, figuring out how to make it work. 1994, I think. Maybe 95. Do you have the building permit? I might have some paperwork somewhere. Sarah Chen made more notes. What about the electrical connections? I can see wiring running to several of the structures. The electrical work had been done in phases over the years. First, just a simple outlet by the back door so Elena could use her electric pruning shears. Then connections to the greenhouse for a small heater and grow lights. Eventually, a full circuit that powered the water pump for the irrigation system and the lights that let me work in the garden during the short winter days. My brother-in-law, Tommy, did most of the electrical work. He was a licensed electrician. Do you have permits for the electrical installations? Tommy might have pulled permits. I'd have to check. Jim Morrison was photographing the compost bins now, taking pictures from multiple angles like they were crime scenes. The bins were made from pallets I'd gotten for free from businesses that were just going to throw them away. Inside, layers of kitchen scraps and yard waste were slowly transforming into the rich, dark compost that fed all my plants. "These composting structures," Sarah Chen said, "they're quite close to the property line. Are you aware of setback requirements for waste processing facilities?" Waste processing facilities? I almost laughed. These were compost bins, the same kind of compost bins that people had been using for thousands of years to turn organic waste into garden gold. "They're compost bins," I said, "for kitchen scraps and grass clippings. The city classifies composting operations as waste processing, which requires special permits if they're over a certain size." I looked at my 3 simple compost bins, each about 4 feet square, and tried to understand how they could be classified as industrial waste processing facilities. "Do you see any evidence of rodent activity?" Sarah Chen asked Jim Morrison. Some disturbed soil around the base of the compost area, he replied, taking more photographs. Could indicate burrowing. I wanted to tell them that disturbed soil around compost bins was normal, that earthworms and beneficial insects naturally gravitated toward composting areas, that this was how healthy soil ecosystems were supposed to work. But I could tell they weren't interested in education about soil biology. They spent another 30 minutes documenting everything, measuring structures, photographing plants, making notes about every aspect of the garden that didn't conform to their vision of what a residential backyard should look like. Mr. DeLuca, Sarah Chen said finally, I'm going to need to issue you a notice of violation. You have 30 days to bring these structures into compliance with current building codes, or remove them from the property. 30 days. I looked around at what Elena and I had built over 43 years, what had fed our family and half the neighborhood, what had provided habitat for birds and bees and butterflies, what had given Elena purpose during her illness, and me comfort during my grief. What exactly needs to be brought into compliance? The greenhouse needs a building permit and inspection. The electrical work needs permits and inspection. The compost operation needs to be moved away from property lines or reduced in size. The tool shed needs a permit. Several of the raised bed structures may need to be modified or removed if they don't meet current setback requirements. She handed me a manila envelope thick with official documents. There's also the issue of the overall density of vegetation. Current zoning codes limit the percentage of lot coverage by non-grass vegetation to 40%. Your property appears to exceed that significantly. 40%. I tried to calculate what percentage of my backyard was actually lawn anymore. Maybe 10%, a few narrow pathways of grass between the growing beds. The rest was food plants, fruit trees, herbs, flowers that attracted pollinators. After Sarah Chen and Jim Morrison left, I stood in my backyard holding the envelope of violation notices, trying to process what had just happened. 43 years of careful work, and they wanted it reduced to 40% coverage of non-grass vegetation. I looked over at Brad Hoffman's yard, where he was now pretending to check his mailbox while obviously wanting to come over and ask how the inspection had gone. His backyard was about the same size as mine, but it couldn't have been more different. Perfect lawn, perfectly edged, perfectly green from the chemical treatments he paid a service to apply every month. A pool with expensive tile work, an outdoor kitchen that probably cost more than I'd made in 5 years working for the railroad, lounge furniture that looked like it belonged in a resort hotel. Not a single food plant, not one fruit tree or vegetable bed or herb garden, just expensive decoration and chemical-dependent grass. Brad must have decided I'd had enough time to absorb the bad news, because he came walking over with that casual swagger he used when he wanted to pretend he wasn't being deliberately intrusive. So, Frank, how did that go? I looked at him, this 42-year-old tech entrepreneur who'd moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, and immediately started complaining about everything that didn't match his vision of what an upscale residential area should look like. They issued violation notices. Oh, that's too bad. He didn't sound like it was too bad. He sounded like Christmas had come early. What kind of violations? Building permits, setbacks, lot coverage limits. Lot coverage limits? What's that about? I explained about the 40% limit on non-grass vegetation, and Brad nodded, like this made perfect sense to him. Well, that's reasonable. You can't just turn a residential property into a farm, you know? This is a neighborhood, not agricultural zoning. I wanted to point out that my farm had been feeding his family too, at least indirectly. When Jessica had been pregnant with Tyler, she'd come over regularly asking for herbs and vegetables, claiming the store-bought stuff didn't taste right and made her feel sick. I'd sent her home with bags of organic produce, glad to share what Elena and I had grown. But I could see Brad didn't want to have that conversation. Frank, buddy, look, I know this is hard, but maybe this is an opportunity, you know, to simplify things. You're what, 78 now? How much longer can you really keep up with all this maintenance? I was 78, and while I moved slower than I used to, I could still tend my garden, still grow enough food to share with neighbors, still find satisfaction in working with my hands and watching things grow. The garden doesn't require much maintenance once it's established. Most of these plants take care of themselves. But Frank, be realistic. The watering, the weeding, the harvesting, the composting. It's a lot of work for a man your age. And what happens when you can't do it anymore? Who's going to take care of all this? It was a question I'd been asking myself since Elena died, but hearing it from Brad made it sound like an accusation. I manage fine. I'm sure you do, but for how long? Wouldn't it make more sense to sell now, while you can still enjoy the money? I know some developers who'd pay top dollar for this lot. And there it was. The real reason for the code enforcement complaint. The real motivation behind his sudden concern for my well-being. Brad wanted my property. I'm not selling. Frank, come on, look at this place. It's become a jungle. Property values in this neighborhood have gone up 300% in the last 5 years. My house is worth $2.2 million now. Having this agricultural operation next door isn't exactly helping maintain property values. This garden has been here longer than you have. I know, and I respect that. But times change, you know? This neighborhood is attracting a different kind of resident now. Professionals, families with significant incomes, people who care about maintaining certain standards. Certain standards, like chemical lawns and outdoor kitchens and pools that used enough water to irrigate a small farm. Brad, let me ask you something. When's the last time you grew your own food? He looked puzzled, like I'd asked him about quantum physics. What does that have to do with anything? When's the last time you knew where your food came from? When you helped a neighbor? When you created something useful instead of just buying something expensive? Frank, I don't have time for hobbies. I'm running 3 companies. I employ 46 people. I contribute to the economy. This isn't a hobby. This is how communities used to work, before everyone decided they were too important to get their hands dirty. Look, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but this is about practicality. Your garden brings down property values for everyone on this street. It makes the whole neighborhood look less desirable to the kind of people we want living here. I stared at him, trying to understand how someone could live next door to a productive garden for 5 years and see it as nothing but a threat to his investment portfolio. What kind of people do you want living here, Brad? Successful people. People who take pride in their properties. People who understand that a nice neighborhood requires everyone to maintain certain standards of appearance and property care. And you think my garden doesn't meet those standards? Frank, look around. I mean, really look. Tool sheds built from scrap wood, compost piles, vegetables growing right up to the property line. It looks like, I don't know, like a Depression-era farm or something. What's wrong with a Depression-era farm? Nothing's wrong with it, if that's what you're going for. But this is a residential neighborhood in 2024. People expect a certain level of aesthetics, a certain quality of life. I looked over at Brad's backyard again, with its sterile perfection, and its complete inability to support any form of life beyond chemically maintained grass. Tell me something, Brad. If there was an emergency, if the grocery stores closed for a month, what would your yard feed your family? He looked confused again. What kind of emergency? Any kind. Natural disaster, supply chain breakdown, economic collapse. What would you eat if you couldn't just buy whatever you needed? Frank, you're talking about some kind of doomsday scenario. That's not realistic. Is it? What about 2020, when people were panic buying groceries and fighting over toilet paper? Remember that? When the stores ran out of fresh produce and people were scared to leave their houses? That was different. How was it different? That was a temporary disruption. The supply chains recovered. And what did you eat during that temporary disruption? Brad was getting uncomfortable now. I could see him trying to remember what his family had done for fresh food during the worst months of the pandemic. We managed fine. We paid extra for delivery services. You paid extra because you could afford to. What about families who couldn't afford to pay extra? What about elderly people who couldn't figure out the delivery apps? What does this have to do with your code violations? It has to do with what's valuable, Brad. What's actually valuable versus what just looks expensive. I gestured toward my garden, where the spring lettuce was ready for harvest and the pea plants were beginning to flower. This garden fed 6 families during the pandemic. Mrs. Peterson, the Martinez family across the street, the Johnsons behind us, the young couple with the baby 3 houses down. Free food, no delivery fees, no empty shelves, no panic buying. It's not generosity, Brad. It's community. It's what neighbors used to do for each other before everyone decided that paying money was easier than creating relationships. Brad looked around my garden with what might have been a flicker of understanding, but it passed quickly. Look, Frank, I get that you're attached to this place, but you have to be practical. The code violations are real. The city isn't going to just forget about them. And honestly, fighting this is going to cost you more than it's worth. How do you figure that? Legal fees, contractor costs to bring everything up to code, time and stress dealing with bureaucracy. At your age, do you really want to go through all that? What's the alternative? Sell to a developer. Take the money and buy a nice condo somewhere with a maintenance-free lifestyle. No more worrying about permits and code enforcement. No more back-breaking work in the garden. Just relaxation and financial security. Maintenance-free lifestyle. Financial security. Words that were supposed to sound appealing but mostly just sounded lonely. Brad, let me tell you something. This garden isn't work to me. It's purpose. It's connection to the seasons, to the community, to something bigger than myself. You can't buy that with a maintenance-free condo. Frank, you're being sentimental. Maybe I am. But sentiment is just another word for caring about something more than its cash value. Brad's friendly mask was starting to slip. I could see his frustration with my refusal to see reason, as he defined it. Look, old man, one way or another, this neighborhood is changing. Property values are going up, standards are getting higher, and people like me are moving in. You can either get with the program or get pushed out. Your choice. People like him, successful people who measured everything by its market value and its contribution to their investment portfolios. And what happens to people like me in your vision of the future neighborhood? People like you find places that are more appropriate for your lifestyle and income level. Places like where? I don't know. Senior communities, maybe. Places designed for older people who want simpler living arrangements. I looked at Brad's house, with its 3-car garage and its professionally landscaped front yard and its security system that probably cost more per month than I spent on groceries. How long have you lived in this neighborhood, Brad? 5 years. And how long have I lived here? I don't know, a long time. 37 years. Elena and I bought this house in 1987. We raised our daughter here. We buried both our parents from this house. We celebrated 40 years of marriage in this backyard. So what's your point? My point is that people like you move into neighborhoods built by people like me, and then you decide people like me don't belong here anymore. That's not what this is about. Isn't it? You moved into a neighborhood with gardens and character and community, and now you want to replace all of that with expensive uniformity. I want to maintain property values and neighborhood standards. Whose standards, Brad? Yours? The city's? Or the standards of people who built this neighborhood in the first place? He didn't have an answer for that, or at least not one he wanted to say out loud. Look, Frank, I'm trying to be reasonable here. The code violations are going to force changes whether you like it or not. I'm offering you a way to come out ahead financially. And I'm telling you I'm not interested. Then you're going to lose. The city's going to force compliance. You're going to spend a fortune trying to fight it. And in the end, you'll be stuck with a property that's worth less than it would be today. Maybe. Or maybe I'll find a way to fight this that you haven't considered. Brad laughed, not with humor, but with the kind of condescension that rich people use when poor people talk about fighting back. Frank, what are you going to do? Hire lawyers? Appeal to the city council? This is 2024, not 1987. Things are different now. Money talks, and I have more money than you do. Money isn't everything, Brad. No, but it's most things. And in this case, it's the thing that matters. After Brad went back to his house, I sat on my back porch with the envelope of violation notices, trying to understand how my life had become a legal problem that needed to be solved within 30 days. The violations were extensive and detailed. The greenhouse required a building permit, a structural engineering report, and compliance with current building codes that hadn't existed when Elena and I built it in 1994. The electrical work needed permits and inspection by a licensed electrician, even though it had been installed by a licensed electrician and had been working safely for decades. The compost bins needed to be moved at least 10 feet from any property line, which would put them in the middle of my vegetable beds. The tool shed needed a permit and might need to be demolished if it didn't meet current setback requirements. But the biggest issue was the lot coverage violation. Current zoning codes limited non-grass vegetation to 40% of the total lot area. My garden covered approximately 80% of my backyard, meaning I would need to remove half of everything Elena and I had planted over 4 decades. I tried to imagine what 40% coverage would look like. Maybe I could keep 2 or 3 of the fruit trees, maybe one section of raised beds for vegetables. The greenhouse would probably have to go entirely, too close to the property line under current setback requirements. The berry bushes would have to be removed. The herb gardens would have to be reduced to maybe 1 small bed. The compost operation would have to be eliminated or moved to a location that would make it largely useless. In other words, I would have to destroy most of what Elena and I had built together. That evening, I called my daughter Maria in Portland. It was 8 o'clock my time, 6 o'clock hers, and I could hear the sounds of her preparing dinner in the background. "Dad, what's wrong? You never call during the dinner hour." "I need some advice, sweetheart. The city wants me to tear down most of the garden." The sounds of cooking stopped. "What? Why?" I explained about the code enforcement visit, about Brad's complaints, about the 30-day deadline to bring everything into compliance or remove it. "Dad, that's ridiculous. That garden has been there longer than most of the houses in the neighborhood." That's what I told them, but apparently that doesn't matter. "Do you have any of the original building permits? Any documentation that shows when things were built?" "I might have some paperwork in the basement. Your mother kept everything, but I haven't looked through those boxes since she died." "Dad, you need to find that paperwork. If structures were built legally under previous codes, they might be grandfathered in under current regulations. Even if they are, there's still the lot coverage issue. They say I can only have 40% of the yard in non-grass vegetation." 40%? That's insane. What's the justification for that? "Something about maintaining neighborhood character and property values." Maria was quiet for a long moment. I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably trying to process the implications of what I was telling her. "Dad, I think you need to fight this." "Fight it how?" "Brad's right about one thing. I don't have the money for a long legal battle." "You might not need a legal battle. There are other ways to approach this." "Such as?" "Public pressure, media attention, community organizing. This isn't just about your garden, Dad. This is about gentrification, about longtime residents being pushed out by newcomers who want to remake neighborhoods in their own image." "I'm just one old man with a vegetable garden." "No, you're not. You're a 78-year-old man who's been feeding his neighbors for decades, who built something beautiful and useful with his own hands, who's being harassed by a wealthy newcomer who wants to eliminate anything that doesn't contribute to his property values." She had a point. When she put it that way, it sounded like a story that might resonate with people beyond just my immediate situation. "Maria, I don't want to become some kind of cause célèbre. I just want to keep my garden." "Dad, sometimes keeping what you love means being willing to fight for it publicly. Sometimes private resistance isn't enough." "I wouldn't know how to begin." "Start with documentation. Find every piece of paperwork Mom saved, every photograph, every record that shows how long the garden has been there and how it's been part of the community. Then we figure out next steps." After we hung up, I went down to the basement and started looking through the boxes Elena had labeled house stuff and garden records and important papers. I hadn't been through these boxes since she died, and opening them felt like archaeology, like excavating layers of our shared life. The first box contained building permits and inspection records going back to 1987, when we'd first bought the house. I found permits for the electrical work Tommy had done in 1989, 1994, and 2001. I found inspection certificates for the greenhouse, dated 1995, showing that it had been built to code and properly inspected. I found receipts for materials, photographs documenting construction projects, even hand-drawn plans Elena had made for various garden expansions. She'd been meticulous about documentation, saving everything in manila folders labeled with dates and project descriptions. But the most interesting discovery was a folder labeled Community Garden Project, 1998. Inside were newspaper clippings, city council meeting minutes, and correspondence with the Parks and Recreation Department about a proposal Elena had made to turn our garden into an official community garden. The proposal had been detailed and well-researched. Elena had documented the amount of food our garden produced, the number of neighbors who benefited from fresh produce, the educational value for neighborhood children. She'd included photographs, testimonials from families who relied on our vegetables, and a financial analysis showing the cost savings to the community. The city had ultimately decided not to move forward with the community garden designation, but the documentation showed official recognition of our garden's community value. There were letters from the Parks Department praising Elena's vision, from the mayor's office acknowledging the contribution our garden made to neighborhood food security. In another folder, I found documentation of the garden's role during various local emergencies. During the ice storm of 2009, when power was out for 6 days, our gas-powered generator had kept our greenhouse warm, and our preserved food had supplemented what neighbors could get from closed stores. During the economic recession of 2008 to 2009, our garden had provided free food to 3 families who'd lost jobs and couldn't afford groceries. The COVID-19 pandemic documentation was even more extensive. Elena had kept careful records of how much food we'd given away during 2020 and 2021. Over 2,000 pounds of vegetables, fruits, and herbs distributed to neighbor families, many of them essential workers who couldn't afford organic produce or elderly people who were afraid to go to crowded stores. Looking through these boxes, I realized Elena had been building a case for our garden's community value for decades, even if she'd never called it that. She'd documented every way our little piece of land had contributed to neighborhood resilience, food security, education, and community building. The next morning, I called Maria back. "I found a lot of documentation," I told her. "More than I expected." "What kind of documentation?" I described the building permits, the community garden proposal, the emergency response records, the food distribution logs. "Dad, this is incredible. You don't just have a vegetable garden. You have a documented community resource that's been operating for decades with city knowledge and approval. Does that matter legally? It might. But more importantly, it matters politically. This isn't just about code violations anymore. This is about the value of community resources, about local food security, about environmental sustainability. I'm still not sure I want to make this into a big public issue." "Dad, it's already a public issue. Brad made it public when he called code enforcement. The question now is whether you're going to let him control the narrative or whether you're going to tell your own story." That afternoon, I had an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Peterson knocked on my front door, leaning heavily on the walker she'd been using since her hip replacement surgery the previous fall. "Frank, I heard about the city inspectors yesterday. What's going on?" I invited her in and explained about the code violations, about Brad's complaints, about the 30-day deadline. Mrs. Peterson was 85, had lived in the neighborhood for 42 years, and had never been shy about expressing her opinions on neighborhood matters. "That young man thinks he owns the whole street," she said, settling into Elena's old chair at the kitchen table. "Ever since he moved in, it's been one complaint after another. My wind chimes are too noisy. The Garcia's children play outside too loudly. Your garden blocks his view of the sunset." "He complained about your wind chimes?" "Called the city about noise ordinances. Said they were disturbing his work-from-home setup. I told the inspector that my wind chimes had been hanging on my porch since before Brad Hoffman was born, and if he didn't like the sound of wind chimes, he should have bought a house in a quieter neighborhood." "What did the inspector say?" "Nothing. Noise complaint was dismissed. But it's the principle, Frank. This boy moves into a neighborhood with character and history, and then he wants to sanitize it to match his idea of what an upscale area should look like. Mrs. Peterson accepted a cup of tea and settled in for what I recognized as one of her longer visits. She'd been Elena's closest friend in the neighborhood, and since Elena's death, she'd appointed herself the keeper of neighborhood memory and gossip. "You know what really bothers me?" she continued. "It's not just the complaints, it's the attitude, like we're all just temporary residents who need to be managed until he can replace us with people more like him." He did suggest that I might be happier in a senior community somewhere. Of course he did. Get rid of all the old people, all the families who've been here for decades, all the gardens and character and community connections. Replace everything with people who have enough money to maintain property values and enough social status to make him feel important. "Mrs. Peterson, what am I going to do about these code violations? I can't afford to hire lawyers and fight the city." She stirred her tea thoughtfully, the same way Elena used to when she was working through a complex problem. "Frank, how many families have you fed from this garden over the years?" I thought about it. Regular recipients like Mrs. Peterson and the Martinez family, plus occasional neighbors who'd come by during hard times, plus the pandemic distribution. Maybe 20 or 30 families total over the years, more during emergencies. "And how much money have you saved this neighborhood in grocery costs?" "I never calculated it." "Well, maybe you should. Because what you have here isn't just a hobby garden. It's a community resource. And communities have ways of protecting their resources when they're threatened." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you don't have to fight this alone, Frank. This neighborhood has more history and more connections than Brad Hoffman realizes." Mrs. Peterson spent the next hour telling me things about the neighborhood I'd never known, even after living here for 37 years. She knew which city council members had grown up in the area, which local business owners had been customers of the various community gardens that used to exist throughout the city, which neighborhood families had connections to local media and politics. "The key," she said, "is to make this about more than just your garden. Make it about what kind of community we want to be, what kind of values we want to preserve, what kind of future we want for neighborhoods like ours." "I'm not good at that kind of organizing, Mrs. Peterson. Elena was the one who knew how to talk to people about big picture issues." "You don't have to be Elena, Frank. You just have to be willing to let other people help you tell your story." After she left, I spent the evening going through more boxes than I'd opened in 3 years. My knees complained, but my hands were steady. I made piles on the basement floor, permits with permits, photos with photos, letters of thanks in a neat stack that still smelled faintly of the lavender Elena kept in every drawer. I found the greenhouse inspection from 1995, a building permit number with an inspector's signature so bold it crossed the line like a little fence jumper. I found Tommy's electrician paperwork, 3 separate permits, each stamped finaled. I found a letter from the Parks Department, dated November 1998, thanking Mrs. Elena DeLuca and Mr. Frank DeLuca for contributing to community food security during seasonal shortages. There was even a grainy newspaper clip from the ice storm in 2009, a photo of me in a wool cap handing a bag of potatoes to the Garcias on their porch. Near the bottom of a banker's box, I found something that made me sit on the concrete for a while with my jaw clenched until it passed. A blue folder with Elena's handwriting. Garden Legal Policy. And inside, a note to herself: if they ever come for the garden, show them what it feeds. Under the note were charts she'd made by hand, columns of dates and weights, pounds of tomatoes, pounds of greens, quarts of sauce canned, jars of jam sealed, a ledger of the plain bounty of sunlight and time. I carried everything upstairs and spread it on the dining table in tidy rows the way she used to lay out recipes for a holiday meal. When I called Maria and told her what I'd found, the relief in her voice felt almost like a chair being pulled up for me at a table I thought I'd been banned from. "Dad," she said, "this is the record. This is how we build the story and the appeal." An appeal. The word tasted like a dry cracker. "It's an administrative appeal first. We ask for a stay on enforcement. I'll draft something tonight." "You're all the way in Portland." I can write from anywhere. I didn't sleep much. I moved stacks around like chess pieces, labeling each with yellow sticky notes. At some point, the night turned itself off and the house went blue and quiet. The pre-dawn hour when you can hear your own blood talk. When the first sparrows started complaining about nothing in particular, I made coffee in the blue mug, paused with my hand on the handle, and told Elena about the day. I told her about Sarah Chen's careful voice, about Brad's smile that only moved the top half of his face, about Mrs. Peterson's wind chimes and the way small things can be big on principle. Maria sent a draft at 7:15. I read it twice. It had her mother's spine in it. Request for stay and administrative appeal, the first page read. And then, under that, 3 arguments. 1. Grandfathered status for the greenhouse and electrical under existing permits. 2. Composting within residential allowances with mitigation. 3. Misinterpretation or overreach in applying the 40% non-grass vegetation threshold to a rear yard urban agriculture site with documented community benefit. It wasn't just legalese. It had photos of kids picking peas, a bar graph of pounds of produce donated in 2020 and 2021, copies of the 1995 inspection, and letters from the Parks Department. Submit this today, Maria said. Ask them to pause the 30-day clock until the appeal is heard. I printed everything and slid it into one of Elena's old binders. She used to say, "If you give them paper they can hold, they have to hold the idea too." I showered, put on a clean shirt, and was about to leave when someone knocked on the front door. It wasn't code enforcement. It was the reporter Maria had emailed, Lydia Reyes from the East Side Chronicle, a young woman with a notepad, a camera, and a tote bag that said, "Local food is civic infrastructure." "Mr. DeLuca, would you have a few minutes to talk about your garden?" I hesitated. I could hear Brad's voice in my head. "You don't want to make this public." But the public was already in my driveway, and Elena's blue folder was on my table like a drum. "Come around back," I said. In the morning light, the greenhouse panes caught the sun in a patchwork of small, imperfect squares. Lydia walked slowly, her eyes quick and interested. She didn't point the camera at the messes. She pointed it at the vines, the seedlings, the rain barrel with a line on it where last summer's drought had paused the birds. "How long have you been growing food here?" she asked. "Since '88, I said. "Longer, if you count pots on the porch of our first apartment." "And you've been giving food away?" "When it's there to give. We eat first, and then the garden tells us what to do with the rest." She wrote that down. I showed her the binders. She photographed the permits, the letters, the charts. When she asked about the violations, I kept it factual. When she asked about Brad's complaint, I said, "My neighbor filed a complaint. The city is doing its job. I'd like the city to see the garden accurately." "Accurately how?" "As something that feeds people, cools the block in heat waves, soaks up the rain instead of letting it run off, keeps bees and butterflies alive enough to do what they've been doing since before we knew the words for it." "You make it sound almost like infrastructure," she said, tapping her tote bag. "It is," I said, and something in my chest released. She stayed an hour. By the time she left, I had just enough time to drop the binder at City Hall. Sarah Chen wasn't at the counter, but the woman who accepted the appeal packet read the cover letter twice and said, "We'll get this in front of the hearing officer. The stay on enforcement will be considered with the appeal. Do I get a receipt?" She stamped the top page and handed me the packet back with a barcoded strip and an official stamp you could hear in your bones. "This is your receipt." When I walked out into the noon light, Mrs. Peterson was on my porch with a clipboard and a pen, like she was organizing a bake sale. "Sign-up sheet," she said before I could ask. "Volunteers for whatever this fight turns into, and a petition." "To whom?" "To everyone." She'd already filled 3 pages with names I recognized and some I didn't. The Martinez kids had printed their names carefully. Mr. Johnson from the house behind ours had written, "Robert Bo Johnson Sr." in a hand that belonged on a chalkboard. Someone had drawn a pea vine curling around the margin of the first page. "Mrs. Peterson," I said, "you're supposed to be resting that hip." "I'm resting it right here," she said, tapping the porch. "You can sit while you fight." By mid-afternoon, the story was online. The headline read, "Maple Street Garden faces code enforcement. Is this the neighborhood we want?" I wasn't on social media, but the neighborhood is, and the link traveled from phone to phone faster than zinnias attract butterflies. People I hadn't seen in months stopped at the gate to say they were sorry, or angry, or that they never knew Basil could smell like that. A high school science teacher asked if she could bring her environmental club by on Saturday to take pollinator counts and draw maps of shade versus grass heat. A guy I'd only ever waved at on morning walks said his sister worked at a nonprofit called City Harvest, and they had a pro bono attorney who might be interested. At 4, the doorbell rang again. Sarah Chen stood on the porch, hair tucked behind one ear. The same crisp uniform, the same clipboard, but her voice was softer at the edges. "Mr. DeLuca, I saw that you filed an appeal this morning." "I did." "We received it. I'm here today to let you know that enforcement is paused until the hearing." "That's good news." She hesitated. "I also wanted to take another look at the greenhouse and the electrical, given the documents you submitted." I led her through the house. Jim Morrison wasn't with her. On the porch, she paused to look at the lilac bush and smiled without writing anything down. We went through each structure again. I pointed to the inspection stickers, the conduit runs, the weatherproof boxes. She took notes, slower this time. "You've maintained this meticulously," she said. "It's been our winter job," I said. "Me and my brother-in-law when he was still alive." At the compost bins, she crouched and peered at the base. "We ask people to use rodent-resistant bins for anything over a certain volume," she said. "I can connect you with a city program that offers them at reduced cost, and moving them 2 feet inward would satisfy the setback even under the most conservative reading." "I can manage 2 feet," I said. She stood and looked around, turning slowly, the way people do when they're trying to see the whole of something they've only seen in parts. "Mr. DeLuca, my job is to enforce the code," she said finally. "But the code is a tool. It's not a theology." She looked almost embarrassed. "You didn't hear that from me." "I didn't hear anything," I said. On her way out, she touched the greenhouse door, just a finger on the glass, and said, "My grandmother kept a yard like this, behind a duplex in Alhambra. She grew bitter melons and chives and called it ugly in the way people call babies ugly to keep the gods from noticing them. It fed all of us." After she left, I sat on the back steps a while and let the sun do its slow afternoon work. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something older and wider, like a river settling into its banks after almost spilling over. It wasn't victory, not yet. It was simply the right next thing. That evening, Maria called again. "I've heard from City Harvest," she said. "They want to help. They have an attorney. Her name is Aisha Qureshi, and a civic planner who can speak to the policy around urban agriculture. Also, the Chronicle piece is getting traction. There's talk of a segment on public radio." "I don't know about the radio, kid," I said, though I did know I would do it if it meant showing one more person what a leaf looks like up close. "Don't worry about any of that tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we start drafting testimony. We'll need people who can speak to the garden's role: food, heat mitigation, stormwater, education, community." "Mrs. Peterson can speak to anything," I said. "I know," Maria said. "I saw the petition." 2 days later, the garden held a potluck it hadn't planned. People brought what they had and what they were proud of. Mrs. Peterson made deviled eggs with dill from my herb bed. The Martinez family brought tamales that disappeared like rain on July clay. The Johnsons brought a peach cobbler that made you understand how peaches got their reputations. Someone set up a folding table near the compost, and I gave a demonstration on how to layer green and brown materials, while a half circle of neighborhood parents pretended to be there for their kids, but not for the compost. "Why the paper?" a little boy asked, pointing at the shredded newspaper. "Carbon," I said. "The food scraps are nitrogen. The paper is carbon. Together they make balance, and balance makes heat, and heat makes compost fast enough to outpace the critters." He nodded solemnly. "Like a volcano." "Exactly like a polite volcano," I said, and his mother wrote that down. On the same afternoon, Brad held court on his patio with 3 men in shirts so white they looked illegal. He glanced over once or twice, caught my eye, and smiled like an ad for a product that made you faintly ashamed of not buying it. There was a time in my life when I would have taken a plate over to him as an offering of peace. I tried to decide whether that time had passed. In the end, I sent 2 jars of jam and a bag of basil with his wife when she walked by with the stroller, and she looked embarrassed to take them and relieved to have something to do with her hands. The hearing was set for 2 weeks from the day I filed the appeal. The night before, I barely slept. I sat at the table with the binders and Maria on video between Portland mornings and my late night. She had flown in the day before, and now she was at my kitchen table in a t-shirt from a library conference and a stare that was half Elena and half her own stubborn magic. "We're going to let them talk first," she said. "Then Aisha will present the legal points. You'll tell the story of the garden. Then we'll call witnesses. Keep your testimony concrete. Numbers and neighbors. Less philosophy." "I wasn't planning to get philosophical," I said, and she smiled in a way that reminded me of every time I had, in fact, gotten philosophical. The hearing room was smaller than it had seemed when I was younger. The council members sat behind a long curved desk that made them look like the stern parents of an unruly family. Sarah Chen was seated off to one side with 2 other city staffers. Brad was there with someone who was either his attorney or a man who was born wearing a tie. When they called my case, the hearing officer, a woman with dark glasses and a pen that clicked more than it wrote, read the complaint and the violations. Then she asked if the city wished to speak. A man with a neat mustache stood. "The city recognizes the unique circumstances of this property," he said, "but must enforce the code as written." He summarized the violations. He acknowledged my filed permits and the 1995 inspection certificate, offering to withdraw the greenhouse and electrical counts pending verification. He gestured at a slide on the screen behind him. Remaining issues include compost setback and the lot coverage threshold of non-grass vegetation exceeding 40%. "Thank you," the hearing officer said, clicking her pen 3 times in a way that probably meant nothing. Aisha stood next. She wore a navy blazer without apology. "Madam Hearing Officer," she began, "we appreciate the city's willingness to withdraw items that are clearly permitted and inspected already. On compost, my client has already committed to install rodent-resistant bins and move the operation to satisfy the setback. On the lot coverage threshold, we believe the city's application is both novel and contrary to the spirit of the code." She clicked a remote. A slide appeared with the code's language highlighted. The 40% limitation was adopted in 2006 to discourage full paving and synthetic turf in front yards, not to criminalize biodiversity in rear yards. The definition of non-grass vegetation, as presented by enforcement, has never been interpreted to include edible gardens maintained without nuisance. Moreover, the code includes an explicit encouragement of drought-tolerant and native planting, both of which Mr. DeLuca uses to reduce water consumption and heat island effect. She changed slides again. Charts. Numbers. I recognized Elena's ledger in the right-hand column, rendered into neat bars and percentages. The garden has provided, at conservative estimate, 2,000 pounds of free produce during the 2020 to 2021 pandemic period and hundreds more pounds in subsequent years. It collects and reuses rainwater, reduces stormwater runoff, maintains pollinator habitat, and serves as an informal educational space for neighborhood children. We ask, at minimum, for a variance recognizing the garden's community benefit, and at best, for a policy clarification exempting established urban agriculture from the 40% threshold. Then it was my turn. I stood and held the blue mug, not because I'd planned a prop, but because I'd forgotten to let go of it. I set it on the lectern like a small, honest anchor. "My name is Frank DeLuca," I said. "I live at 218 Maple. My wife and I bought that house in 1987. We planted a lilac by the front door in '88 and tomatoes out back the same summer. We built our greenhouse out of salvaged windows in 1994 when the doctors told us a project would help Elena through chemo. We pulled the permit, passed inspection. We built compost bins with pallets because wood knows how to become soil if you ask it right and give it a little air. I looked up and saw Sarah Chen watching me the way you watch a robin when it finally comes back in spring. I've been told this garden looks like a farm, I continued. Maybe it does. It's fed people like one. During the ice storm of 2009, we pulled potatoes and winter greens and handed them across fences when the stores were closed. During the pandemic, we filled paper bags with lettuce and herbs and jars of sauce and left them on porches. I'm 78, and this garden is not a hobby. It's my way of loving the place I live. I didn't say anything about property values. I didn't say Brad's name. When they called witnesses, Mrs. Peterson walked up with her walker like a weapon. She told them about the wind chimes and about the time Elena had shown her grandson how to thin carrots without crying. The Martinez parents spoke, nervy but steady, about those bags of produce on their porch when they were both working essential shifts and scared to bring their kids to the store. The high school science teacher showed a map of the block's surface temperatures in July. My yard 5 degrees cooler than Brad's lawn at 4 in the afternoon. A shy little girl with a ponytail held up a drawing of my greenhouse with the caption, "Where the tiny leaves live." The last person to speak surprised me. It was Sarah Chen. She asked permission first, and the hearing officer nodded, curious. "I'm an inspector," she said. "My job is to enforce the code, so I'm here to say 2 things. First, Mr. DeLuca is in compliance on the greenhouse and electrical based on the permits submitted. Second, with the mitigation he's proposed, the compost is not a nuisance. On the question of the 40% vegetation threshold, I would respectfully recommend the city consider clarifying the code to support, not penalize, well-maintained rear-yard urban agriculture." She paused, then added quieter, "When I visited the site, I observed no hazards, only a level of care that reflects decades of stewardship." Brad's attorney spoke then, and he did it the way water runs downhill, coherently, confidently, and with no intention of stopping until it hit the lowest point. He said words like precedent and neighborhood standards and detriment to the character of the area. He raised the specter of everyone paving over their lawns with vegetable beds, of property values impacted negatively by non-conforming aesthetics, of the slippery slope of permitting any and all backyard structures under the guise of community benefit. Even he didn't say crazy old man. Brad, impatient, leaned into the microphone from his seat in a way that made his tie jump. "This is not about vegetables," he said, finally letting his jaw do the real work. "This is about a jungle next door. It's about someone who refuses to recognize that neighborhoods evolve. If we want quality residents to move in..." He didn't finish the sentence. The room shifted. Not loudly, but in that way crowds do when everyone becomes a jury at once. The hearing officer clicked her pen twice, then set it down. "Thank you," she said. "We'll deliberate and return with a decision." We waited in a corridor that smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner. Maria squeezed my hand. Mrs. Peterson left spots of lipstick on a Kleenex and then tucked the Kleenex into her sleeve like a talisman. Aisha paced and checked her phone with the air of someone willing it to be a sword. When the hearing officer returned, she looked exactly the same, which I decided was an acquired skill and a kind of kindness. "On the matter of the greenhouse and electrical," she said, "the city acknowledges filed permits and inspections. These items are withdrawn. On the matter of composting, the appellant has agreed to install rodent-resistant containers and adjust setback by 2 feet. With those adjustments, the composting operation is in compliance." She paused and looked down at the papers, even though I had the sense she didn't need to. "On the matter of the 40% threshold, the board finds that applying this metric to a rear-yard urban agriculture site conflicts with the intent of the code and the public interest. We grant a variance for this property recognizing its documented community benefit. Further, we refer to council a recommendation that the code be clarified to exempt well-maintained urban agriculture from the 40% calculation." She clicked the pen once. Appeal granted. The room made a sound like laughter trying to get out of a cough. Maria hugged me so hard, my ribs remembered what it felt like to be 30. Mrs. Peterson cried without bothering to hide it. Aisha permitted herself a smile that probably only came out when children were born, or a city did the right thing before being dragged all the way there. On the way out, I passed Sarah Chen in the hallway. She extended her hand like someone who has been waiting years to shake a particular hand. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. "Ms. Chen," I said. "Just Sarah," she corrected, and her smile reached both halves of her face. "Congratulations." "Thank you for doing your job," I said, and meant it. Brad didn't look at me. He left quickly with his friend the Thai. Outside, the afternoon had turned gold, the way our street does when all the maples decide to give back the light you've lent them all day. People were already congregating at my gate like they were coming home from a long trip. Someone had brought a "We Love the Maple Street Garden" banner. Someone else had found a cowbell. Lydia from the paper stood in the yard and took one photo, not of the garden, but of the people inside it. The city council took up the code clarification a month later. I didn't testify that time. Plenty of others did. A professor from the university talked about heat islands and water infiltration, and how a single large shade tree can redirect the day. A nurse from the clinic talked about food deserts not being deserts so much as deliberate choices. A woman from the Beekeeping Association wore a little pin that buzzed if you got too close. The council passed the clarification 5-2. The next day, the Chronicle ran another story with the line, "The city affirmed the right to grow." That wasn't law exactly. It was language. But language is how laws decide what they mean. The official letter came in the mail, stiff paper in a white envelope that made the day feel ceremonial. It listed the compost adjustments I'd already completed. It confirmed the greenhouse and electrical as permitted and grandfathered. At the bottom, in a paragraph that felt like a footbridge built for careful feet, it said, "In recognition of documented community benefit, the Maple Street Garden is designated a neighborhood resource site." I didn't know what that meant, but it came with a small plaque and a program liaison named Terrence, who wore a baseball cap to his first visit, and asked if I wanted to host one Saturday morning a month for open garden hours. I said yes. It turned out people like having a place to go where nothing needs to be bought to feel like you belong. The first open garden morning, kids ran the paths like water, finding its level. I set up a little table near the greenhouse with seed catalogs and a sign that said, "Ask me anything." A boy who'd come to the hearing with his drawing of the tiny leaves asked if plants got scared in the dark. I said no, not scared, just asleep. A teenage girl wanted to know if you could grow tomatoes in a 5-gallon bucket on an apartment balcony. I said yes, and sent her home with 2 seedlings and a promise to answer texted questions about leggy stems and blossom end rot. Brad didn't show up. His wife did, with the toddler on her hip and a box of store-bought cookies that she set down like a peace plant. Tyler reached toward the strawberry bed with both hands and made noises a human makes when taste and joy meet for the first time. I handed him a berry, and he bit through the red to the white shoulder. For a minute, the world was just the way sugar grows on a vine. "Thank you," Jessica said, eyes on her boy. "You're welcome," I said, eyes on the same boy. That afternoon, I was tying a new length of twine for the peas when I noticed someone at the gate. Brad stood there with an expression I hadn't seen on him, the look of a man who knows the thing he wants is on the other side of something he can't own. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. "I've got as many minutes as I've got," I said. He came in, careful with his shoes, as if dirt might leap up and stain him permanently. He looked around, not like a buyer, not like a judge, just a man in a yard. "I was, he cleared his throat, "out of line at the hearing." "You were clear about what you wanted," I said. I didn't realize all of this." He gestured vaguely at the vines, the berries, the children's shoe prints in the paths. I thought it was just messy. "A lot of life looks messy if you're standing at the wrong distance," I said. He smiled despite himself. "Tyler ate a strawberry today. Wouldn't stop talking about it. He said, 'Dad, it tasted like the color red.'" "That's a good line," I said. "You should write that down." He nodded. "Look, I'm not going to pretend I'm suddenly a convert. I like my lawn. I like things neat. But He stopped, the conflict sitting right behind his teeth. "I don't want to be the guy who chased an old man out of his garden." "You weren't going to chase me out," I said, and for once it didn't sound like a boast. He looked down. I know, I don't like losing. You didn't, I said, surprising myself. Your boy won. He found out what food tastes like when it remembers where it came from. He laughed a little and then looked embarrassed to have laughed. Do you think I could start with something small? Like a pot of basil? Jessica says the stuff from the store tastes like nothing. I've got starts, I said. You want to come back with a pot? I'll show you how to pinch the tops so it keeps making new leaves. He went and came back with a handsome ceramic pot that had probably cost more than my first car payment. We filled it with compost and soil. I showed him how to loosen the roots and how to water without drowning the plant's confidence. Don't overdo it, I said. Most things you can't fix by loving them harder. You have to love them right. He nodded. Got it. At dusk, after everybody left and the banner came down and the cookie crumbs were swept from the table, I took my second cup of coffee into the yard, the same way I always have. The light slid sideways through the grape leaves and made the greenhouse glass look like it was holding stars before the sky was ready to. I picked a sugar snap pea and broke it open with my thumbnail. The sound it made, like a tiny door, gave me a sweetness in the mouth and a memory in the chest. Inside the house, I propped the plaque the city had given me against the window for now. It said, Neighborhood Resource Site, Maple Street Garden. I didn't need the medal to know what we'd made, but I didn't mind that the city had sent a word to meet the thing it tried to name. On the mantel, I put the 1995 inspection certificate in a frame, partly out of spite and mostly out of love for a page that had waited 30 years to be useful again. Next to it, I set one of Elena's jam jars, empty but for the faint stain of fruit at the seam, a little red memory that refused to fade entirely. That night I slept without hearing the house talk. The next morning, I heard the same knock at 8:15 I'd heard the day this started. When I opened the door, Sarah, no clipboard, no uniform, just a person in a green sweater, stood with a paper bag. My grandmother's chive pancakes, she said, shy. She used to make them for celebrations. It seemed like... She searched for the word and then found it. Like we should mark the day. Come in, I said. We ate at the kitchen table where the birds stared at us from their ceramic branches, and Elena's chair sat exactly where she'd left it. The pancakes tasted like onion and home. When she left, I took my mug and walked out to the lilac again. I touched a bloom. We won, I told her out loud, to the woman who taught me to plant the right thing at the right time and trust the rest. I felt foolish and sacred in equal measure, which is how gardening feels most of the time anyway. There is a kind of winning that looks like confetti and shouting. This wasn't that. This was the kind of winning that lets you go back to work. I moved the compost bin those 2 feet because they'd asked me to, and because there's no honor in being right if you refuse to be neighborly. I wrote dates on seed packets with a marker. I thinned the carrots without crying. A week later, a brown envelope arrived with the city seal. Inside was a simple notice. Variance recorded. There was also a brochure, Urban Gardens and You, with a photo not of my yard, but of one that could have been, if you squinted. They'd added a line to the website, Terrence told me, clarifying the 40% threshold. The phone at City Hall started to ring with new questions, not complaints, but beginnings. Could someone grow food in a shared backyard? Could an empty lot become a community garden? Could the city build a program to teach composting on Saturdays? I didn't have to answer any of that. I had a basil class in 10 minutes and a little boy waiting to show me the polite volcano he'd built in his grandmother's yard. At sunset, I sat on the porch steps and looked down the block. Mrs. Peterson's wind chimes did their small weather song. The Martinez's kitchen window was open, and the smell of onions in a hot pan came out like a promise. In the Hoffman's yard, Brad bent over the pot of basil, pinched the top, and smelled his fingers the way a man does when he's trying to understand why something simple could make him feel so much. I picked up my mug. The chip on the handle fit my finger as if it had always been meant to be there. Across the yard, the greenhouse kept the day for the night to remember. Above it, the sky turned the late April color of a bruise finally healing. The garden breathed. I breathed with it. And the neighborhood, by degrees measurable and not, learned how to feed itself again.